Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Again, is the Brownfield Grantwriting Training Webinar Series, Kickstart Your Application, hosted by the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality and the Kansas State University Technical Assistance to Brownfield's program. Today, we'll be presenting webinar number 5, Programmatic Capability and Past Performance. I'm Scott Nightingale with KSU TAB, and I'll be the moderator today. We would like to thank the Louisiana Municipal Advisory and Technical Services Bureau, LMATS, for sponsoring this webinar series and helping us reach municipalities across Louisiana. We will be muting everyone except for the speakers. However, just as a precaution, please go ahead and keep yourself muted individually as well. If you'd like to ask a question at any time during the webinar, please do so by using the group chat box. Type in your questions and we will stop periodically during the webinar to answer them. The slides from this presentation, along with the recording of the meeting, will be available on the KSU TAB website. One thing with that, the recordings for the previous 4 are posted on our website. The one for number 3 is rather long. That's the one where Rebecca talked a lot and we ended up being 2 hours and 50 minutes. So if you have trouble viewing that or downloading it, just let me know. We might have to chunk that up into parts to get it distributed a little better. All right, for today, it's important if you're using your phone for audio that you turn off your computer audio. Otherwise, there might be some feedback that gets through the system for everyone to hear. Audio settings in Zoom can be set by clicking the up arrow adjacent to the mute button, as Rebecca's showing you now. Also, please note the chat button near the bottom right. We spoke about this before, and that's where you can type in questions. Our speaker today is Rebecca Oddie. Rebecca is the Brownfield Coordinator at the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality. She has successfully written several Brownfield assessment grant applications, as well as some unsuccessful ones, gathering a list of lessons learned and grant writing insights that she'll share with you today. Rebecca, please begin.
All right, so welcome to the 5th webinar in our Brownfield Grant Writing Training Series, where we're going to cover the last part of the application. So thanks for sticking all the way through the end. We'll cover programmatic capabilities and past performance. This is where you're going to let EPA know what you will know that you're going to do an amazing job managing this money and lay out the team that you have in place to execute your work plan and as well as lay out your past success at managing grant funding. So as a reminder, these webinars are based on the previous year's Brownfield requests for applications for assessment funding. The new request for applications is expected to be issued in late August. It might have some changes in it, and we're going to go over those in the final webinar in the series, which will happen once that RFA comes out. This webinar, this section is actually pretty small, so we probably won't take the entire time allotted. So we'll have an extended amount of time for Q&A at the end. We're also going to have a panel of our previous presenters to get some additional tips and insights to strengthen your proposal. All right, so note that for parts 1, 2, and 3 of the application, those are reviewed by a 3-person panel that's made up of an EPA Region 6 Brownfields person, a Brownfields person from another EPA region that might not really understand our specific geographies, so you kind of have to spell things out for them, and another Region 6 federal person outside the Brownfields program. Part 4 of the application that we're going to go over today is scored solely by a person in EPA Region 6 Brownfields program. So for the other sections, your score is based on the average of 3 reviewers' scores, whereas in this section, your score is just based on 1 reviewer's scores. So that means each point that you earn, it's a full point because you're not averaging it with the other scores. So it's really important for this section. Make sure to check all the boxes and give them all the information that's requested so you can get the maximum score for this section. But also be aware you're talking to someone now who might be a little bit more familiar with your geography, and you really just need to check the boxes on this section and save a little space to go over in more detail for the other parts of your application. So in today's webinar, we'll cover part 4 of your application, programmatic capabilities and past performance. Under programmatic capabilities, you'll talk about the organizational structure you have in place to make sure this funding will be managed and tracked appropriately. You'll also talk about your key staff, who specifically will be working on this grant and what expertise or experience do they have to ensure that the project is completed, reports are submitted to EPA, everything is going smoothly. And then how you'll acquire additional resources like an environmental consultant to perform the environmental assessments, making sure to note your competitive process. Under past performance and accomplishments, you'll talk about your track record with managing Brownfield or other grant funding, or if you haven't received funding in the past, we're going to talk about how to address that in the application as well. So let's start with programmatic capabilities. Per the previous request for applications, you can group organizational structure and description of key staff into the same response. That's A, I, and II. So we're going to talk about those together. So here's the ranking and evaluation criteria. You'll want to talk about how your organization is set up to ensure that the funding is spent in a timely manner and that your work plan goals will be accomplished within the 3-year grant period. Very important. You'll also want to note your plan for completing all the technical, administrative, and financial requirements of the grant. You're going to want to note, who will oversee the technical aspects, including environmental assessments. What's your plan for addressing all the administrative strings that come attached to EPA funding? For instance, the reporting requirements. And what financial systems you have in place to actually draw down on the grant and track the use of the funding. If you're applying for coalition funding, you'll also talk about how your coalition members will be involved throughout the grant period and how you will coordinate on decision making. EPA will especially be looking for meaningful involvement of each member in determining how grant funds will benefit each member's community. It doesn't have to be elaborate, again, just make sure to check the box and include that information. Okay, Scott, real quick, can you hear the people in the background?
No, I cannot.
Okay, then I will just keep going. So under description of key staff, you will talk about who you have on board to actually execute the grant work plan. What is each person's responsibility and what's their background that indicates that they're going to do a good job. So in this section, you'll want to describe your organization. What type of organization are you? If you're not a municipality, you might want to give, a little detail on this. For example, if you're a regional planning commission, you might want to talk about the parishes that are included in your region and give a brief overview of the programs that might relate back to brownfields, like economic development or transportation. If you're a nonprofit, you'll want to talk about what your mission is and how that relates to brownfields. Remember, it doesn't have to be elaborate. Make sure, keep it brief. A sentence or two at most, and remember to relate it back to brownfields and how you're set up to successfully manage this funding. As we talked about in the last webinar about noting the lead for each task, the EPA wants to know who you specifically have on board to execute the grant work plan. So you can note who that specific person is in the previous section, but you definitely want to include names in this section for key staff. So some key members of your brownfield team include your brownfield coordinator. So who is going to be the main EPA contact that they'll work with on a day-to-day basis? Who's going to ensure that the work plan is being executed, things are moving along, everything's going smoothly. So some entities, they'll choose to contract out most of the grant work plan, including reporting to EPA, overseeing the environmental assessments, conducting outreach events. But you should still have someone on your staff that's responsible for overseeing that consultant and making sure that the grant is progressing. It also helps build institutional knowledge within your organization in case something happens in the future and the environmental contractor is no longer involved in your program. or that contractor has some staff turnover and the person that you were working with suddenly disappears. It's also helpful to note the fiscal person at your organization who will be responsible for tracking the expenses and making the drawdowns on your grant. Good fiscal policy, this person is not the same as your Brownfield coordinator, so you have a system of checks and balances. You might also briefly mention the financial systems you have in place to manage the funds. If you've already set up an ASAP, which is the automated standard application for payment system, that's how you draw down funds from EPA. You might mention that. You might include the name of the financial software you use to track expenses. And if you have space, you could briefly mention your process for reviewing and approving invoices to show sound fiscal management. If you're applying for a coalition grant, include at least one key contact for each coalition member organization. At a minimum, I would mention the main contact person that will be involved, along with their role in executing the grant work plan, especially noting their role in selecting sites and assisting with outreach in their geographic area. So in addition to mentioning the name of your key staff members, also, give a little bit of background and relates why they can do the work that you're saying that they can do. Remember that the ranking criteria specifically asks for their role, their expertise, qualifications, and experience. So for instance, does your fiscal person have a degree in accounting and has been working as a CPA for 10 years? You might want to mention that. Or has your Brownfield coordinator managed similar funding in the past? What's their background qualifications that would indicate they would do a good job managing this funding? Again, you don't have to go into a whole bio on each person. Really a sentence or two on each one is enough. You just want to give EPA enough detail so they're confident your key staff can execute this funding if awarded. Note, KSU hosted a webinar on building a Brownfields program that provides some additional insights as to who you might want to include in your Brownfields team. Just FYI, given the limited number of pages, you don't have to include your entire team in this section of your proposal. But if you haven't had a Brownfield program for a while or you're just starting one up, it is really good to know who you're going to need to have on board to actually execute the grant just for your own planning purposes. So if you're starting a new program or reinvigorating an old one, you might want to watch that webinar, and we've included a link to it in the next steps and useful links document. All right, that gets us to the end of the first section. So let's take a break for the questions. As with the other parts of the application, I really recommend you look through previous proposals to get ideas on what to include and how to format this, and then find a way that works well with the flow of your application. All right, any questions, Scott?
Most of them clothing related due to your pre-webinar. No, nothing other than those.
All right, we're going to keep going. Okay, so next you're going to talk about how you plan on acquiring additional resources. So the most common additional resources for Brownfield grants are hiring an environmental consultant to perform the environmental site assessments and develop cleanup plans. Most organizations that are applying for the funding, they don't have the expertise, the time, and or the insurance to actually conduct environmental assessments. So they need to hire a consultant to do this work. FYI, this is something EPA is actually going to be looking for since conducting environmental assessments is kind of the meat of the grant. If they don't have someone on staff with the time or expertise to actually manage the grant, some grantees will hire a firm to oversee all of the grant activities. As I mentioned before, this can include completing the required reports for EPA, conducting outreach events, overseeing environmental assessments, and other grant-related activities. So sometimes this is the same firm that actually does the environmental assessments. Sometimes it's a different firm that then oversees the consultant who's actually doing the investigations. It's really up to the entity that's applying for funding to figure out what they can handle in-house and what they might need help with managing. So again, you might want to check out that KSU webinar on building a Brownfields program on additional insights for this. And then Scott and I were happy to talk you through this, figure out what might work best for your organization. The other most common reason to acquire additional resources is to hire a contractor to assist with community outreach and or marketing your program. This is something that I really appreciate. I have learned that is a very specialized field, and they can come up with some really creative ideas of reaching your target audience. So it's worth looking into whether you want to do that in-house or hire a firm that specifically knows how to market these types of programs. All right, so here's the ranking and evaluation criteria for this section. Basically, EPA is looking to see that you have a process in place to secure any additional resources you might need to execute the work plan. They're also looking to see that you have a competitive process for securing the consultants. This can be a full RFP that you distribute, locally or statewide or nationally, or it can be as simple as obtaining responses from 3 or more qualified firms. The important thing with this is that it's some type of competitive process. It's not sole sourced, and that you have a process in place so that when you're awarded funding, you either already have a contractor on board or you're ready to go with the contractor selection process. An additional note on this, EPA solicitation clauses state, applicants may not award sole source contracts to consulting, engineering, or other firms assisting applicants with the proposal solely based on the firm's role in preparing the proposal solicitation. So basically, you can't give the firm a contract for the environmental assessment work or to oversee your grant just because they wrote the application for you. I've seen this happen several times. A consulting firm offers to write the grant application for an entity pro bono. Then when it gets selected, the consulting firm comes back and says, hey, we can manage that for you. Just sign here on this contract. It sounds good in theory, but it is not allowed. They can actually write the grant proposal for you pro bono, but there still needs to be some type of competitive selection process for the work that's actually going to be funded by the grant. You also don't have to identify a specific contractor in your proposal. However, if you do, the fact that you name that consultant in your proposal doesn't relieve you of the obligations to comply with the competitive procurement requirements. So some people in the past, they tried to get around the competitive requirements by including the name of the consultant in their proposal. Does not work, raises red flags with EPA. Don't do it. If you do mention a specific contractor in your proposal, just be sure to note how they were selected. What was your competitive process for selecting them? And note that KSU tab can help with the contractor selection process. They can help review your request for proposals before you send it out and provide feedback on how well the applicants responded to your RFP. All right, so let's talk about some examples of how to procure a contractor. This is really up to your organization. I'm just throwing these out here just so that you know some of the options that are out there, but really what works best for your organization. You want to comply with whatever your policies and procedures are for this. Some cities, they have a short list of environmental consultants that have already been through some type of selection or vetting process that are used for similar services already. You can use that same list of consultants to conduct environmental assessments at your brownfield sites, as long as it's the similar scope and whatever request for proposals you send out to generate that list. Some organizations, they'll issue a request for proposals before applying for the funding and then incorporate everything into that RFP, preparing the application, overseeing the grant work plan, performing environmental assessments. This has the advantage of having the contractor in place as soon as the project period starts. and that contractor is then familiar with the grant scope of work since they wrote it. Just remember that you can't use the grant funding to pay the contractor for anything related to putting together the grant application. Or another option, you could issue the RFP in the 3 to 4 month period between when the grant awards are announced, which is normally around June, and when the cooperative agreement actually starts, which is normally October 1st. This has the advantage of having the consultant in place as soon as the grant starts, which is good, but you don't have to go through the RFP process before you actually know that you're getting the funding. For a lot of us, that RFP process takes a lot of time and effort, so you might want to wait until you know you get the funding before you actually go through it. Most of the grants that I've seen, they wait until the project period actually starts to issue the RFP and select a contractor. While this delays when you'll actually have the contractor in place, most organizations really don't like to issue a contract or even an RFP until that cooperative agreement is actually in place. It also allows you to use the grant funding for the RFP process. So these are just some examples of how different organizations choose their environmental consultant. For purposes of our webinar today, the important thing is communicate to EPA what your process is so they feel confident that you will be able to get a contractor on board quickly. This has been a stumbling block in the past. Normally, it takes a lot longer than people really anticipate. So remember that EPA doesn't like to see the funding sitting around not being used. So having a solid plan for hiring an environmental contractor is really key to moving the work plan forward and then drawing down on those grant funds. Related to this, be sure to include a timeline for securing your additional resources in the section. You should have a plan to have the environmental consultant on board within the first 6 months of the grant. The sooner the better. Again, this section is normally a short paragraph. You don't have to talk about this in length. Just check the box and make sure you talk about your competitive selection process, but save extra space for the other parts of your application. Okay, the ranking and evaluation criteria, they talk about contractors and subrecipients. So let's just talk about the difference with those. So a contractor, they're the ones who are providing goods and services on commercial terms. They operate within a competitive environment. They are allowed to charge a reasonable amount of profit, and these require competitive selection. So the example for this is like your environmental consultant, or if you're hiring a marketing contractor, something like that, a professional firm. Subrecipients, this is more the pass-through funding to another organization that's going to carry out a portion of the work plan. They can only receive reimbursement for actual costs, so they can't include any profit in their request. It doesn't require any kind of competitive selection. So an example for this is if you're going to do an intergovernmental agreement with one of your coalition members to conduct outreach or oversee the environmental site assessments, something where they're going to provide a service related to the work plan. For most assessment grants, you won't have subrecipients, but you should have at least one contractor, again, the environmental consulting firm who's going to be doing the assessment work. If you're applying for a coalition grant, a coalition member might be a subrecipient. Again, if you're asking them to help with a portion of the work, and they will be paid out of this grant for that work. Okay, told you this one was short. That's it for section 4A. So let's go over the next steps. So you want to start, describe your organization. How does your work or mission relate back to Brownfield? Describe your key staff. Make sure to include the role, expertise, qualifications, and experience. You want to at least include your Brownfield coordinator, your fiscal person, and someone from each of your coalition members if you're applying for a coalition grant. And then briefly describe your competitive procurement process for additional services, especially for your environmental consultant for environmental site assessments. All right, let's take a break for questions. And I have one for everybody in the group. So what sections of the grant proposal have you tackled already in your application? You can either type that into, you can just type that into the chat box, so we'll give people a minute or so to respond.
Rebecca, while they're working on that, Kim had a question. Is there a good listing somewhere of potential environmental consultants?
I will double check and see. There used to be one, I think, on one of the state websites. You can also look them up by their license, and I can get you that information. We have specific, when LDEQ issues a request for proposals, we require specific licenses within the state of Louisiana, so you can look them up that way. The other resource that you can use is the Louisiana Brownfield Association. You can, if you send your RFP to them, they can send it out to their members and the people that are on their listserv. And that's a pretty wide swath of environmental consultants throughout the state. One of the keys I will say that you want to look for is that they have done work in Louisiana. Each state is really different on how they are set up, how things are submitted, you know, different ways the regulations are followed, format of reports, that type of thing. So that's something you just really want to look for.
Also, Rebecca, I wanted to ask, you had mentioned not to, not to name the contractor in the grant application. Drawing another comparison to the subrecipients, is it wise, if you do know your subrecipients, to show that detail as much as possible to show EPA you already have a plan for those?
I think it's a good idea. And just for clarification, you can name your contractor in the proposal, and sometimes that can work for you because it shows that you'll be ready to go as soon as you get the grant funds. Just make sure that if you do that, you make sure to note how they were selected and what the competitive process was for selecting them. But if you are planning on having a subrecipient, I would include them because you'll have to include that in your budget anyway. So, make sure you clearly know, this is who we have on board. This is why we think, they're going to do a good job with this work, and these are their qualifications for that. All right, I'm going to keep going. We're going to do a poll question next. We're going to do this one because it relates back to the next section and will help us figure out which sections we really need to cover. So let us know if your entity either currently has a Brownfield grant or received one in the past, has never received an EPA Brownfields grant, but has received other federal or non-federal assistance agreements, or if you've never received any type of grant funding at all, federal, non-federal, nothing, you've never managed any type of grant funding in the past. So Scott, all right, Scott's got the poll up.
Still have some answers coming in. I'll share the results here in a second.
Okay. All right, so a little over half have had a Brownfield grant before. 36%, they've never managed a Brownfield grant, but they've received other funding. And then we've got 9% that have never received any type of federal or non-federal assistance agreement. So good kind of mix of people. All right. There we go. All right. So the final section of your application, this is where you're going to talk about your past performance and your accomplishments with previous funding. Keep in mind that this is reviewed solely by the EPA Region 6 Brownfield person. So as we mentioned before in the poll, there are 3 options for how to answer this, depending on if your entity currently has or previously had a Brownfield grant, hasn't received a Brownfield grant, but has received other type of funding in the past, or if you've never received any type of grant in the past. So for this section, you don't answer all 3, you just note which one applies, and then you provide information that EPA is requesting based on that response. Note that last year, the RFA stated EPA intends to use about 50% of the total amount of funding available for grants to new applicants. So for those of you who have never received a Brownfield grant, please don't be discouraged. There is a pretty big set aside for new grantees because they recognize, we were getting the same people over and over. So they really do want to open it up to new folks coming in. All right, so option 1 is for organizations that currently have or previously had a Brownfield grant. So you're going to talk about your entity's most recent EPA Brownfield grants, up to 3, how you successfully manage them, and the wonderful things that resulted as a result from EPA's investment. So more specifically, you're going to talk about your accomplishments, including your outputs. Remember, those are your grant deliverables and things that were accomplished during the grant period, and your outcomes. Those were the great things that happened after the grant ended as a result of your funding. So EPA is asking specifically for the number of sites you assessed and or cleaned up depending on the funding type, but you could also include the amount of leverage funding, the number of jobs created, a note on any redevelopment activities, what were the great things that happened at the end. Okay. Remember, I think I've said this at least once, if not twice, acres is super important to EPA. So that's the assessment, cleanup, and redevelopment exchange system that EPA uses to keep track of all the sites where they've invested money in. So they ask you to discuss if all of the outputs and outcomes you're talking about have been entered into acres at the time you submitted this application. So if you're behind in updating acres, now is a great time to, bring that all up to date, and then make sure to state specifically that acres is up to date in your application. Next, for entities who have had Brownfield grants in the past, you're going to talk about your compliance with the grant requirements. Did you meet the work plan schedule and complete all the tasks within the project period? That also includes any EPA approved extensions. Did you submit your quarterly reports to EPA? Were you up to date on all of that? If at some point, stuff happens, sometimes your program might lag, or for some reason you didn't submit all your quarterly reports on time, that's okay. Just explain what happened, how you corrected it, and now how you're going to move forward to be successful in the future. So most commonly this occurs when a Brownfield coordinator leaves and no one is immediately assigned to take over the program, or they operated somewhat in a vacuum, so no one is really aware of the reporting requirements or really what needs to be done. For some organizations, it might take 6 months or a year until they get someone new. If that happened in your organization, just explain what happened, how you now have some awesome Brownfield coordinator on board to move forward, how you're now up to date on all your reporting requirements, which hopefully you are, and you have a transition plan in place to make sure things don't lag again when a transition occurs, which hopefully you now do. For any of your open EPA grants, include the grant period, and if you have funds remaining, your plans to use up those funds by the end of the grant period. What projects are those funds committed to? What else do you have in place to spend down that funding? Remember that you're going to need to draw down at least 70% of your current open grant funds by October 1st in order to be eligible to apply for a new Brownfield grant. And that October 1st deadline I've seen a couple times now, so I think that's pretty set in place. For any of your closed grants, you'll note if there were funds remaining when you closed them out, and if so, kind of a brief explanation on why the funds weren't expended. I wouldn't really worry about it too much if it was less than $1,000. It's hard to spend a grant down to zero. So you could just say that you completed the scope of work and it came in under budget. If it's more than $1,000, you might need to explain that a little bit more, but still just kind of keep it brief. All right, so here's an example from last year's competition from Portland, Maine. Just on a side note, successful proposals from last year are now posted on KSU's website, so be sure to check those out. We've updated the link information in the Next Steps and Useful Links document, so you can easily find those. So what I liked about this one, first of all, they started off by clearly stating what category they fell under. Remember, make it obvious for EPA, include those headers for each section. Then they provided a general overview of their successful Brownfield grant program, including what grants they've, the 3 most recent grants they've managed. And then they stated the accomplishments for each of their 3 most recent Brownfield grants. I only included one here for space, but they did have paragraphs for each grant. They included how many assessments they completed and how those projects are progressing. Note, the sites aren't all redeveloped yet. It's perfectly okay if your projects are still in progress. You know, just kind of paint that good picture that they're still moving forward. All right, then they went over their compliance with the grant requirements, including completing the work plans, meeting programmatic requirements, and submitting quarterly reports and acres information in a timely manner. All right, note at the bottom though, things did not always go smoothly. They had to give back over $300,000 in prior revolving loan funds, but they stated what happened, how that was corrected, and they were still successful in their application. So just make sure to communicate to EPA because they will know if you didn't submit all your quarterly reports. Just make sure you state why and how you've corrected that to move forward. All right, so let's say you haven't had a Brownfield grant in the past, but you have managed other grant funding either from a federal agency or another entity. So instead of talking about your Brownfield grants, you're going to talk about other grants you've managed, again, up to 3. You want to choose grants that are similar in size, scope, and relevance to the Brownfield funding you're applying for. So let's say, for instance, you're asking for a $500,000 Brownfield Coalition grant, and your organization has managed, you know, you have your options between a $10,000 grant and a $600,000 grant. You probably want to highlight the $600,000 grant because it's similar in size. Or if you had a grant that had regular reporting requirements, especially if it was a federal grant, you know, involved overseeing a consultant, reaching out to the community, you know, that would be a good one to highlight as well. If you need help in choosing which ones to highlight, again, give Scott and I a call and we can help you kind of sort through and figure out which ones are the good ones to bring up. So you're going to want to talk about how you successfully managed the agreements and successfully performed all the phases of the work by providing the following information. So you want to talk about who gave you the funding, the amount of funding that they gave you, the purpose of the funding, and the accomplishments, including your outputs and outcomes, and then your measures for success. So what did you use to actually measure the success of this grant funding? How did you know that it went well? Similar to applicants who received Brownfield funding, you're going to talk about how you complied with the work plan, including whether or not you completed the work scope on time and submitted all the required progress reports to the funder. And as with the received Brownfield category, if something happened and you missed some reports, you know, just explain why, how you fixed it, and then if you have, and then just, you know, how you're going to move forward. But just a note on this, kind of think about it. If you have the option of highlighting a grant where you missed reporting requirements and one that you met all the requirements, you may want to go with the one where you actually met all the requirements. So then you don't have to spend that space explaining what happened. So here's an example from a successful proposal from last year. Note again, clearly stated which category they fell into. I like how they included a table with the grants that they're highlighting, but if you don't have space for the table, you know, putting that in text works too. Note that they restated that these are similar in size, scope, and relevance to this application. So then they talked about each of the grants, including information on what the grant was for, the outputs and the outcomes. And they, again, included similar paragraphs for each of the grants noted in their table. I'm just kind of highlighting one of them for reference. And then they talked about how they complied with all the grant requirements, including the reporting requirements. They also talked about how they regularly conduct audits of their organization, and they haven't had any findings of significance. This is something that used to be a requirement that you had to specifically state if you had any audit findings. So you'll probably see this in people who have submitted Brownfield grant proposals before. It wasn't required last year, but it doesn't really hurt to mention it if you have the space, that you have some kind of regular audit program in place to make sure that the funds are being expended correctly. So the final category is for entities that have never received any type of grant funding. If you fall into this category, just state this and you'll receive a neutral score of 5 points. So basically, you get 5 points for stating you've never received any type of funding, or you get 0 points if you don't answer the question at all. So be sure to include the statement if that applies to you. All right, so the next steps for section 4B, currently has or previously had a Brownfield grant. You're going to want to develop your list of your Brownfield grants, list out your accomplishments, including your outputs and your outcomes, tally up the number of sites that you assessed or cleaned up, make sure to get your acres reporting up to date and make sure you state that it's up to date in your application. And then you want to talk about your compliance with the work plan, especially the schedule that you completed things on time, the compliance with your reporting requirements, and then note the amount remaining at grant closeout, and if you had funds remaining, just kind of an explanation as to why. If you have not received Brownfield funding before, but you've received other assistance, you want to describe 1 to 3 similar grants that your entity has managed, similar in size, scope, and relevance. Make sure to include the awarding agency organization, the amount of funding, the purpose of the assistance agreement, again, those accomplishments, how did you measure success, and then your compliance with the work plan and the reporting requirements. And then if you've never received any type of federal funding or grant assistance in the past, make sure, write your statement saying that you've never received anything. And then you're going to have a lot of space left over. Make sure to really use that space well and beef up the rest of your application. It's going to be a little bit of a challenge if you've never managed any kind of grant funding in the past. So you want to make sure to get every point in all the other sections. All right. So that brings us to the end of the narrative part of your application. So this is the time you're going to grab your cup of coffee or tea or water, and let's kind of do the chat session of today's webinar with an extended Q&A section and our expert panel. You can submit questions about the information we covered today or anything we covered in the webinars in the past or about the grant proposal or brownfields in general. While people are submitting questions, we'll also have a panel of experts from our previous webinars that are going to provide some additional tips for writing a successful proposal. So welcome back to Danielle Getzinger with Community Lattice. She's also a KSU tab partner. And to Amanda Elwine with the City of Oklahoma City, who they are the hosts for the 2021 National Brownfield Conference next April. And FYI on that, they're actually currently accepting session proposals for the conference. So if you have a great idea for that, make sure to send that in. I'm also reserving the right to call upon our moderator, Scott, with KSU TAB. He has experience with reviewing grant applications and has sat in on some of the EPA debriefs. So he has some expertise from that. So Scott, do we have any questions to answer first?
Yes, we do. If your organization hasn't received federal funding, but your staff has in other professional roles, should you include this to argue for your capacity, or is that not relevant or a good idea?
I would probably, I'm more of a risk taker. I would say go for it.
I would
say,
agree with you.
yeah. And that is something you could also bring up. EPA is going to be hosting, they call them grant chats once the RFA comes out, so you can ask on that. But I would put it in.
And welcome, Danielle and Amanda. Good to have you back.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
All right, well, while we're waiting for folks to send their questions in, I have some for the panel. So first, what do you think makes an application stand out? You know, EPA gets a lot of these every year. Everyone kind of has the same struggles in their neighborhood. What's really something that would make an application stand out? And Danielle, do you want to do this? Take this first?
Sure. I've always used the rule, and it was in EPA Region 1 that came out of a workshop I did there a while ago, and it stuck with me, is that you want to make the reviewers cry. You want to have such a compelling story that it brings a tear in their eyes. So that's what always stuck out to me, is really trying to bring out that human component, that human compassion of why they should give your community money.
And Amanda, any recommendations?
Yeah, I would say definitely being able to tell your story, because that is, you know, for like the city of Oklahoma City, we have a story that separates us from everyone else. And being able, because you have to fill out this application, there's limited space, you have to answer so many questions, but you still have to find out a way to make your story stand out, and they remember it, and they're interested in it. So it's got to be interesting. It can't, you can just answer the questions, but if you really want to make it stand out, it's got to be, you've got to tell a good story.
Yeah, I think I've heard Denise with EPA Region 6, she has said, you want to make them cry, and then you want to make them cheer for you. Like really have that emotional reaction. All right. So based on your proposal reviews, pardon? Okay, so this one is for Danielle and Scott. So based on your review of proposals and the EPA debriefs you participated in, what's a common issue that you see in applications that people should be looking out for? Danielle?
Sure. A common issue is not clearly defining your target area and tying that into your story. We see that a lot. I think that's probably where I work with the most as a reviewer for KSU, work with communities to really tighten that up and have just the geographic area, be well defined, but also the story of that area tie into the whole application.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's what you helped me with last year.
Yep. And you won.
Yep, that's true. Scott, any recommendations on your end?
Yeah, one thing that I see, and it's really frustrating because these are so competitive, is if somebody just doesn't get all of the sections, answered. Mm-hmm. You can lose, 5 points somewhere because you just didn't think you had anything to say, and that's it. Your whole thing's shot. That's one of the things we can help with, We'll make sure that you've got something for every spot there when we review it for you. And it just is sad to see a really good application miss out because of just one missing section.
Yeah, and just
to add to that.
Go ahead, Danielle.
Add to that with making sure that threshold criteria is spot on, because it doesn't matter how good your application is if you can't get through that. I helped a couple communities out that they ended up getting a 0 score, and it was a really good proposal, but something went wrong, right up front.
I want to jump in on this one too, because you have to answer the questions in the sections that they're asked. And one thing I've run into in the past is, oh, we've already answered that particular point earlier in our proposal, but making sure that you answer it in the section where the points are awarded, even if it is repetitive, because if you don't answer it in the section that covers that with those points attributed to that, you don't get them. So don't just assume because it was in your proposal earlier that they'll make that connection. Make sure it is in the section that the points are allotted to.
And in fact, it should be repetitive. It's a design to reiterate those points, and you should carry that through. That's a good point, Amanda.
Yeah, I would agree. And related to that, you know, stick to the number of pages that they say for the narrative proposal. Anything over than that, they rip off, and the reviewer never sees. So if you've got something, if they say you've got 10 pages and you've got one answer on page 11, you've just lost all those points, whatever's on page 1. So stick to those page numbers, very important. All right. So looking back and, kind of putting these together can be a little bit overwhelming. So what worked well for you in putting together the application? What would you have done differently? Any tips for organizing a proposal or tackling it? Amanda, you want to start this one?
Sure. The first thing I do when the proposals come out is I look at the due date, I get a calendar, and I put on this calendar when I expect to do my first drafts, when I should have, if there are letters of support or whatever documents I need along with it from the states. I make sure that I basically have a schedule for when I'm going to ask them, when I'm going to follow up, when am I going to send it to outside review, because in our organization, I take the first stab at our draft grant application. Then I always send it to at least 2 or 3 people to look over it and evaluate it. And so the time, if you don't stay on top of it, the time will get past you. And so if you have basically a calendar with these are milestones that I must meet, and stay on top of that, because if you don't, you'll end up the night before, or the night that it's due at midnight trying to get that in at the last minute, and there's a lot of errors that can occur then. So definitely scheduling out your milestones on when you want to have these things done, so that you have plenty of time to get through it, and plenty of time to send it to KSU tab or to somebody else in your organization to get their perspective on it. Because when I'm writing things, I think it makes sense. It's a great story, but somebody else may see it and they're like, no, I don't get what you mean. And so it's good to have that outside perspective.
Yeah, and I actually set it up in Excel so I can note, I think it's going to take this many days and that many days. And then all I have to do is change the due date of the application, and it'll automatically adjust all the other times for me. So that's something that you can kind of start on now, just putting that together and thinking it through. And then once the due date comes out, you can put that in and then see where everything else falls out. Danielle, any recommendations, tips, tricks?
Sure. I mean, you guys, first of all, are far more organized than I am, and I highly recommend that everybody follow that method as opposed to the midnight writing. I work well under pressure. What I would
Everybody's
say
different.
Everybody's different. So if you're not type A and you're more chaos, this might actually work well with you. I think that this is a creative process. And for your brain to be able to maximize, just to optimize that creativity, you need to build that time and whatever else into the process so that you can create that story. There's a bit of persuasive creative writing here. It's not quite as easy as, filling out this form, filling out that form. So while you have that schedule up and it's regimented, know that there is going to be writer's block. There's going to be times where you just have to, I go down so many rabbit holes, and it's kind of fun because you can dive into a city's culture, its history, and get inspiration from various other places that you might not. I mean, right now I'm reading a book on that just came out on the history of Houston that has so much relevancy into the Brownfield program. So go down those rabbit holes, allow yourself to be creative and to think about the story and how you can be compelling.
I think that's really good advice, because I will have the tendency of trying to get it all right the first time and not allow for that creative process, because it does take more time. But it's a much better grant application once you kind of let you get in that creative thinking mindset.
And it's okay to burn it all down and reboot.
Yeah.
That I have done many times. It's frustrating, but it sometimes is needed.
It's definitely a process. I know. And one of the things, you know, an engineering professor once said in one of our classes, he's like, I don't know why everybody starts with the hard sections first. Start with the easy ones and get them done. So like I've already started on this last section because honestly, it's the easiest one to write. So go ahead, you know, don't feel like you have to do everything in order. Kind of tackle the sections where you can make some progress now. Like I said, this last section that we covered today, pretty easy, more factual based. So it's nice if you need a break from trying to do the creative writing or data gathering. Also the project partners, that's another good one to kind of think about who you're going to partner with in the future and call them up because they get excited about your project, and that can give you a little jolt of energy as well. So don't feel like you have to go in order either.
Data is another thing that you can get pretty easily if you know where your target area is.
All right.
You know what? I want to jump in on that data part too, because one thing I'm not good at is pulling census data and statistics. And so I always have to get an outside person to pull those numbers for me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of one of the key parts of our grant applications are those numbers. And so I always have to kind of tap into that person's expertise early on to get those numbers to make sure that it matches the story that I'm telling. So that's an interesting part too, is that, you know, if you don't have the tools, find out who does and tap into them.
Yeah, use your resources. All right, next one, very important question. What snacks do you keep on hand while you're writing or reviewing a grant? Danielle?
Well, if we're being honest, to kind of go with that creative writing piece, I usually have a glass of whiskey. You know, that's kind of my go-to. But, you know, if you're healthier, you know, having little snacks that are like the mini carrots, because in the stress state, you're going to want to just chomp on something. Doing it in a healthy way is always encouraged, but they also make some really good chocolates at Costco. So indulge a little whiskey too.
Amanda, any suggestions for snacks?
You know, I am straight Diet Coke and coffee, and I alternate.
My goodness.
If you ever see me in a meeting, it is a Diet Coke after Diet Coke after Diet Coke. I might have a problem.
I don't encourage the whiskey during the day. I would say the coffee during the day, and then when you're up at midnight working, treat yourself with a little something.
A little something extra.
Mm-hmm. And it could be tea. That's fine. People do that.
I'm a tea drinker. All right. Any other recommendations? Amanda, Danielle, Scott, anything else you want to add?
I'll add that I typically have, like I said, 2 to 3 or more people review the application once I've put a draft together. But a lot of times I don't always agree with their feedback. So because you're the one writing it and you're the one who's checking the boxes, don't feel like you always have to take the feedback. You know, if you don't feel like it's stronger for your case or whatever, you're, you know, basically in charge of writing this application, and especially if you're in charge of running the program, but you know, make sure it fits your program, make sure that it's doable, and it really, and this might have gone back to organizing, but I always go through and I take the points and I merge it with the section. So when it describes the section that you are supposed to be describing, and then later on there's another portion that describes the points allotted to each section, I merge those two so I can read what that section is supposed to cover, and then also read what I'm going to be basically earning points on, because I think it's important, and it definitely shapes the way I write that proposal. So.
Yeah, that's a really good suggestion, making sure you're covering both.
I would say that there's first of all, this is supposed to be hard. I think that even the most seasoned grant writers out there are hitting their heads against the wall for this grant. Have had other grant writers who don't do EPA grants that have built a career on EPA grants who have said that this is a really difficult grant to get through. But as you're putting this effort in, even if you don't win a grant, think about this as an opportunity to really think about how you're serving that target area, and how you could be building out a brownfields program and approaching the environmental complexities to revitalizing that area with or without the grant. And how would you go about doing that? So I think that it's not a wasted effort, it's not wasted time, and to get something out of it with or without the money at the end of the day.
And I'll jump in on that comment, because also is looking to look around and see what else is going on in your community, because if you have a planning, our program is held in the planning department, but if you have a planning initiative or something going on and you can link the two, it shows a stronger plan, it shows forward. And so if you can show the other things in your community that you'll be merging with, or kind of working with in your program, it just shows that you have a stronger application, I feel. I mean, they do have the link, but look around and see what other options in your community that will help, that you could leverage, or that this program could be leveraged with to accomplish these end goals. Because these brownfield grants, they are ideally they're part of something bigger. Although they're great, it's a great tool to have, but you have to have other tools, because if you just assess and don't have any money for cleanup, or don't have any money for redevelopment or some other type of plan, then it doesn't do any good. If so just look at the other tools in your community to add to and bring to.
And to add on that, Amanda, as you're looking at these different programs and within the community and those stakeholders, maybe the nonprofits, especially the nonprofits, they have probably written similar grants and already have a lot of language that you can take, copy, paste, massage, take the idea from. So as you're reviewing other EPA grants from around the region, review other applications for community revitalization coming out of that community.
Yeah, those are actually, you can, if it's in your target area, you can reference those in your application. According to, blah, blah, blah's report, there's this much crime or this much blighted property, you can reference those, and it shows that you're connected with the community in your target area.
Yeah, and as you're reaching out to those community members, even if some of that isn't documented in public record, they maybe have applied for a grant that they wasn't awarded, and they know why it wasn't awarded. They might be able to use some of that language and strengthen that language where they knew it was a little bit weak into your grant. We've done that with a couple of communities, and it seemed to work out really well.
That's great. All right, Scott, any more questions from the audience, or Amanda or Danielle, anything you want to add?
No, I don't have anything else, but I think that my contact information is in here. KSU tab is, of course, a fantastic resource, and feel free to reach out to me directly if anybody has any questions.
I would say that as you're putting together your application, don't get too frustrated. I've been doing this for 11 years, and this is my least favorite thing to do. It's awful. And I've done it. I've probably done it about 10 years in a row, or 10 different times. It's very, very difficult, and it is very difficult for everybody. So I'm not looking forward to it, but once you have that tool in once you're allotted that grant, if you win, it's a great tool to have. But just don't get discouraged. Even those of us who've done it for a long time get discouraged and get frustrated. It's hard, extremely hard, but it's worthwhile if you can get the grant. So
yeah, if you're a visual person, put up pictures of the sites you want to assess, and like if you have them, like future potential reuses, like keep the eye on the prize. It's worth it to go through it. It is a difficult grant to write, but as Amanda mentioned, once you actually get the grant, you can do such great things with it. And I think any of us who have dealt in the brownfields world knows, like, it's a labor of love. If these were easy, they would have been redeveloped already. But it really is such a wonderful tool to address and help facilitate the redevelopment of those trouble sites in the community that really can blight it and bring it down. But once they're redeveloped, can really uplift the rest of the community and facilitate the revitalization of the rest of the neighborhood. So it does help to kind of keep an eye on that as you're going through this.
And I'm going to do still a little bit of a plug for the national conference will be held here in Oklahoma City next April. So if this is an area that you're interested in, we'd love to have you come to Oklahoma City. And we've been able to use these tools to better our community. And I'd love for you guys to come see for y'all to come see our city.
It's great. I am looking forward to that. All right. So I don't think we have any more questions. Is that correct, Scott?
That is correct.
Okay. All right. So we're going to go into, I just have some random tips for you. Just some, things to keep in mind, or things that I don't know that came up in other places that we just wanted to make sure to cover. First, if you are not registered already, make sure you're registered on grants.gov, which includes getting that DUNS number and registering on sam.gov. Now we're going to go through a few that are regarding formatting. I recommend you use a header on each page, or you can also put this information in the footer. Make sure to include the name of your organization and the type of grant you're applying for. It kind of helps remind the reviewer, whose application they're looking at. Because keep in mind, they're looking at about 10 at a time. It's also helpful if the pages get separated, something happens, then it's easy for them to put back together. On that too, make sure to include page numbers. I think every EPA grant writing session I've been to, they mention this at least once. It really helps if the pages get separated. It's easy for them to put them back in order. And it also helps when the reviewers are discussing your proposal. If one of them is saying, oh, they didn't include such and such, then another one can say, oh, but on page 5, it's in this section. So make sure to include page numbers at the bottom. Once you're done with your application, print it out and kind of look at it for white space. Be nice to your reviewer. Try not to shrink everything down so it's really hard to read. Try to include at least a little bit of space in between paragraphs. Make it easy on them to review as much as possible. Like we've mentioned before, clearly label each section of your proposal. That includes the headers within the narrative, but you're going to have the narrative proposal, you'll have the threshold criteria. If you have a coalition grant, you'll have coalition letters. You'll have a letter from LDEQ to attach, so make sure you're labeling those attachments as well. You can put in header pages for those, just so it's very organized and it's very clear what information is in there. These are a few tips that I got from another grant writing workshop that was on last week. If you haven't already, just start with a basic inventory of brownfield sites in your community. Just kind of put it together. What do you have? That's a good place to start if you don't have an inventory already. Remember, you can add to this later on. You can subtract from it later on. Just get started with a basic inventory of the brownfield sites. Now is a really good time to do that before the request for application comes out. Also, along with that, conduct a basic inventory of the environmental justice issues in your community. Think about, what are they struggling with? Do they need better paying jobs? Do they have particular health concerns? Is it not really a walkable neighborhood? Is there crime an issue? What are the environmental justice issues that might be impacting your community? Like we mentioned before, it is a pretty comprehensive grant proposal. It can take, some people it's 100 hours up to 300 plus hours, depending on how much time you put into it to prepare an application. So definitely starting early helps. And then, as we mentioned several times, have someone outside of Brownfield to review your proposal. And I would recommend, allow enough time for their review. You want to give them probably 3-4 days to review it. And then for you to incorporate the comments. It'll take you time to read through them, talk to them about it to see what they were thinking, and then incorporate those in. So as Amanda suggested, in your schedule, just make sure you're allowing time for that. And just as a reminder, if you're interested in KSU tab reviewing your proposal, make sure just shoot Scott an email and let him know. You can do that now. That helps them plan accordingly and kind of have an idea of how many applications might be coming their way later on. One note, this was something Denise with EPA Region 6 brought up about opportunity zones. We mentioned before, it's really good to include an opportunity zone in your target area. But she also mentioned about a backup option. So if your target area doesn't include an opportunity zone, but there is one nearby or adjacent, you can also talk about how redevelopment in your target area and your priority sites is going to, maybe provide a needed resource for people who live in the opportunity zone. Like, is the people in the opportunity zone need a grocery store, and you're going to put a grocery store in one of your priority sites? That's a correlation. Or a health clinic or a school or something like that. Or, you're right outside the opportunity zone and you're going to do a major manufacturing facility that's going to provide living wage jobs, and people who live in that opportunity zone will be able to take advantage of that. Talking about that. Or, maybe you can talk about expanding the tax base of the overall community, which can then provide resources to that nearby opportunity zone. Or, how can it address other needs of the people in the opportunity zone? So preference, again, best option. If you can, include your opportunity zone in your target area. You don't have to include the whole opportunity zone. You can include a portion of it. That's the best option. But the backup option, if there's one nearby, talk about how those correlate together. All right, again, if we haven't said it enough, make sure to tell your story. Be sure to link the historical, industrial, health history of your target area together and relate it all back to your brownfield sites. Make sure your narrative's consistent throughout the proposal. Insert those unique characteristics that are really going to make it stand out to the reviewers, and make sure that they know that this is your special target area. You also want to make sure you clearly state how this funding is going to benefit your community. One other note that I've heard come up several times now with EPA, think about how you're going to adjust your outreach if COVID is still around. EPA specifically said they are highly likely to ask about that. So you want to talk about, do you have capabilities to do online meetings? Can you do smaller meetings that accommodate requirements for physical distancing and masks? I'm going to be honest, hopefully we will not have to deal with this by October of 2021. However, EPA is still, it's very high on their minds right now. So just be prepared to include that in your application. Random note on data. EPA really wants to see grassroots data on the health statistics in your target area. So if you're not able to get that through state resources, think about contacting your local health agency or a local school, like the school nurse might give you information about absent rates, asthma rates, that type of thing, or maybe a local hospital for information. What you want to do is go back to section 1, where we went over, that was in webinar number 2, where you had your table of brownfield sites and the past uses and the contamination related to those and their health effects. So look at those health effects and ask for that specific information. You know, you're more likely to get that data from them if you're asking for, you know, what are the asthma rates or breast cancer rates or thyroid cancer rates, rather than if you have an open-ended ask for data in general. And also, you know, before you contact them, think about if they also might be a good project partner. And if so, kind of approach them that way as well, to include in your application and in the execution of your work plan. And related to that, I talked about, you know, that section and the information in section 1, where you're going to talk about your brownfield sites and the contamination related to them. In Denise's recent email blast, she noted a document called Environmental Contaminants Often Found at Brownfield Sites. Very helpful. So we've included this link in the useful links document. It lists out the examples of past uses, those contaminants, and then there's also one for those contaminants and the potential health effects. You know, you can actually reference this in your proposal and say, you know, we had a drilling and refining facility on this based on the EPA document, environmental contaminants often found at brownfield sites. You know, petroleum is an issue, and the potential health effects from that include headache, nervous system, immune, liver, kidney, and respiratory damage and cancer. You know, so feel free to reference EPA documents. They love that. Okay, in the previous webinar, one of the tips was to include your priority sites in multiple applications to kind of hedge your bet for the funding. Just FYI, this year LDEQ plans to apply for a brownfield assessment grant, and we are looking for target areas to include in our application. So some of the key factors we're looking for in order to write a compelling application include an area that doesn't have a current brownfield grant that can already provide assessments. You know, we really want to fill in those gaps. The area includes an opportunity zone. I go the easy route, so I go for the ones that already have the opportunity zone in them. The area should have at least 3 priority sites and maybe 15 to 20 or more other brownfield sites. And as we mentioned before, the area has a really good story to tell. So my plan is to focus on 2, maybe 3 target areas, but write the grant so that we can spend money on any site in the state. So if you are interested in being included in our application, you know, feel free to send me in the information. But just note that if we don't include yours specifically in the application, we're going to try to write it in such a way that we can help everybody. Just because there's, you know, only so much space in the proposal, so we can't include everybody. Remember, so you can include the same site in multiple applications. That's okay. What you can't do is draw down on 2 different grants for the same assessment work. So you can't double dip once it actually comes down to drawing down on the funding. So if we are both successful in getting the funding, we're going to let you take the lead on any assessment work that needs to be done, and we'll just fill in where there are gaps. So we'll definitely, you know, let you have the site if you're successful, but if for whatever reason you're not, and we are, then we'll have some funding available to help out. All right, so just a review of the next steps. So programmatic capability, you know, describe your organization, describe your key staff, and then describe your competitive procurement process for any additional services. For past performance and accomplishments, if you currently have or previously received a brownfield grant, you know, develop your list of brownfield sites Make sure you're checking all the boxes of what information to include to convey that to EPA on how you successfully manage that. If you haven't received any brownfield funding in the past, but you've received other brownfield assistance, take a look at everything that you've managed in the past, pick out 1 to 3 similar grants that your entity has managed, and then kind of do your overview of those. Who gave you the funding, how much, what did you do to it, how did you know it was a success, how did you make sure to submit all the reports that were required with that. If you've never received any type of federal or non-federal assistance, make sure, write that statement. Don't forget to include that statement. And then again, use that extra space to beef up the rest of your application. All right, so that wraps us up. The previous webinars, number 1 through 4, they have been posted on the KSU tab resources website. You want to do a search for 2020 LDEQ. As Scott noted, they do take a little while to load. I tried loading it yesterday. It took about 15 minutes. It's kind of a big file, but I just let it run in the background and eventually it did come up. So you might want to, start it up, go get a cup of coffee, go to use the restroom, and then come back and it should be loaded. Our upcoming webinar, so this was the last webinar where we actually cover any of the content of the request for applications. The last webinar in this series is the one we're going to partner with KSU tab. They do an annual national webinar once the request for applications comes out. That'll go over any changes in the application and what's been modified, just to make sure you're going to follow the most recent RFA in that format and what they're asking for. So again, we're expecting the RFA to come out in late August. So that webinar will either be late August or early September. They normally need about a week to read through it and put it together and update their Tab EZ tool. So look for that, and we'll send something out about that once it's set up. We'll also send you notifications about the EPA grant chats. Region 6 normally does those. I think it's like every other week once the RFA comes out. And they've confirmed that they plan to host their annual grant chats again. So we're going to send out those dates once they're scheduled. One tip about this, so we are in EPA Region 6, which is based in Dallas. However, you can attend grant chats hosted by any other EPA region. So we'll try to let you know about other ones that are coming up if we are aware of them. The information, sometimes gets repetitive once you're on several of them, but I found I get kind of little nuggets of information every time that I attend. That's another little helpful tip or helpful insight in that. In between the webinars, if you have additional questions, please feel free to contact me or Scott or any of our speakers. You can also ask Denise Williams or Paul Johnson with EPA Region 6. They can answer questions on pretty much anything until the request for applications comes out. After that, they can only answer questions regarding eligibility, although there's a little leeway on that during the grant chats since anyone can listen in. All right, and here is the contact information as well, and we included the ones for Denise and Paul in case you need that as well. They are both teleworking though. Email is the best way to get a hold of them. All right, so now I'm going to hand it back to Scott at KSU.
Thank you, Rebecca. There are no more messages in the chat. Does anybody have any questions? Okay.
All right. Well, I think that wraps it up for us. So thank you again for attending all the webinars. We will be sending out a survey. This was the first year that we did these webinars. And then EPA upped the timeline for us by several months. So we weren't able to spread these out like we wanted to. But hopefully they were still helpful, and we're going to send a survey out just to see how we can improve on them for next year. That'll come out probably next week, along with a link to a Dropbox folder with all the handouts, just to make sure you have access to those as well. So that's it for the presentation part. We'll stick around a little bit longer if anybody wants to ask another question. But other than that, I hope everyone has a good day and good luck with your applications.
I've also unmuted everybody, so in addition to chat, if you guys just want to speak up, that's fine too.